"You fit the description," the officer said, and the words landed heavier than the hand resting near his radio. The street didn't go quiet all at once. It folded into silence, piece by piece, like the air itself was holding its breath. Tires hummed past slower now. Conversations thinned, and somewhere behind the growing circle, a phone camera clicked on with a faint digital chirp. Aaliyah Carter stood beside the car, her hand still hovering inches from the driver's door, fingers curled like she hadn't decided whether to open it or let go. The sunlight caught the metallic paint, a deep obsidian gloss that reflected everything around her. The storefront windows, the crosswalk lines, the uniform standing too close. She blinked once, steady, her chest rising slow, controlled, like she was measuring every breath against the moment. 19 years old, 5'4", hoodie sleeves slightly too long, and standing next to a vehicle that looked like it belonged to someone twice her age and 10 times her income. The contrast wasn't subtle. It hung in the air, unspoken but loud enough for everyone to hear. Officer Daniel Hayes didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority sat naturally in the way he squared his shoulders, in the way his gaze moved over her not with curiosity, but with conclusion. "Step away from the vehicle," he added, firmer now, each word clipped, practiced. Aaliyah didn't move right away, not out of defiance, out of disbelief, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't argue, just pauses and waits for reality to correct itself. Her eyes flicked briefly to the windshield, catching her own reflection warped across the glass, then back to him. Around them, the world sharpened into details, the faint rattle of a loose sign above a corner shop, the smell of hot asphalt under the late afternoon sun, the low murmur of strangers pretending not to stare while staring anyway. A man across the street slowed his steps. A woman adjusted her sunglasses but didn't look away. The moment stretched thin. "Sir," Aaliyah said finally, her voice even, quieter than expected but clear enough to cut through the tension. "This is my car." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The statement settled between them, simple, factual, almost gentle, and somehow that made it heavier. Hayes's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened, a subtle shift like a door closing. He glanced at the vehicle again, then back at her, measuring not the truth of her words, but the fit of them against what he believed he was seeing. "We've had a report," he replied, and the phrase sounded rehearsed, like it had been used 100 times before in situations just like this. "Now step back." The distance between them felt smaller than it was. Aaliyah lowered her hand slowly, deliberately, letting it fall to her side. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of her jeans, grounding herself in something real, something she could control. The car's surface shimmered beside her, untouched, waiting. Behind her, another phone lifted into view. A soft murmur rippled through the onlookers. No one stepped forward. No one stepped in. And right there, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary street, under a sky that hadn't changed at all, the moment hardened into something else, something colder, heavier, something that hadn't needed to happen, but was already too far in motion to stop. Aaliyah didn't raise her voice again. She just stood there, still, composed, her silence sharper than anything she could have said, as the weight of someone else's assumption settled over her like it had always been waiting for this exact second to fall. Aaliyah had learned early that silence was not emptiness, it was control, and right now it was the only thing she refused to let anyone take from her, as she stood there with the late afternoon sun warming the side of her face and the faint breeze lifting the edge of her sleeve. A small ordinary sensation that felt almost surreal against the weight pressing down on her chest, because just 2 hours ago, she had been somewhere entirely different, sitting at a small kitchen table barely wide. Enough for 2 plates, her laptop open, a stack of printed scholarship forms neatly aligned to the left, and a ceramic mug cooling beside her, the kind with a thin crack near the handle that she refused to throw away because it still held coffee just fine, and her mother's voice had drifted from the other room, soft but tired, asking if she had eaten yet, and Aaliyah had smiled without looking up, saying she would in a minute, because she always said that when she was focused, when her mind was locked onto something bigger than the moment, something that stretched beyond their small apartment and into a future she was building piece by piece with careful decisions and late nights and a kind of quiet discipline that did not need recognition to exist, and the keys to the car had been resting just inches from her hand back then, catching the morning light through the window, heavier than they looked, not because of the metal, but because of everything they represented, every hour she had spent tutoring, every weekend she had skipped going out, every risk she had taken when she decided to invest her savings into something people told her was too ambitious for someone her age. And she remembered the exact moment she picked them up, the way her fingers curled around them slowly, almost cautiously, like she was confirming they were real, like they belonged to her, because for the first time in a long time something did not feel borrowed or temporary. It felt earned, fully and undeniably hers. And now standing here, back on the street with the sound of distant traffic blending into the low hum of a city that did not stop for anyone, she felt that same weight again, but different, distorted, like the meaning of it had been questioned without her permission, and she kept her posture steady, shoulders relaxed, chin level, not because she was not afraid, but because she refused to let fear rewrite what she knew to be true, and her eyes moved briefly over the car once more, tracing the clean lines, the untouched surface, the reflection of the sky stretching across it. And in that reflection she caught a glimpse of herself again, smaller than the moment, maybe, but not invisible, never invisible, even if the world sometimes acted like she was, and somewhere behind her a voice whispered something she could not fully hear, followed by the faint shuffle of shoes against concrete, and the circle around her tightened just enough to be felt, not enough to be acknowledged, and she exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, grounding herself in the only thing that mattered now, the truth that had not changed, the truth that did not need to be louder to be real. And without raising her voice, without stepping forward or back, she let it sit in the air again, firm and unshaken, as if repetition alone could anchor it against everything pushing against her. In that moment, because this was not just about a car, it was about being seen clearly in a world that too often chose not to look twice. Officer Daniel Hayes had already made up his mind before the first word left Aaliyah's mouth, and it showed not in anything loud or obvious, but in the small details that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, in the way he shifted his stance just enough to angle his body between her and the driver's seat, as if the car needed protection from her presence, in the way his eyes moved over her clothes, her hands, her face, not searching for truth, but confirming a story he believed. He already understood, and to him the scene fit too neatly. A young black girl standing beside a luxury vehicle on a street, where people like her were not expected to own something like that. Not at 19, not dressed the way she was, not alone. And that quiet certainty settled into his posture like something practiced over years, something that no longer required conscious thought. While behind him another officer, younger, less rigid, lingered a step back with a tablet in hand, hesitating, just slightly as if waiting for instruction rather than forming his own conclusion. And Hayes spoke again, his tone controlled but edged with impatience, explaining procedure without really explaining anything at all, the kind of language that sounded official enough to close a conversation before it could fully begin. And Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her face still, her breathing steady, her silence not agreement but resistance in its own form, because she could feel it now more clearly than before. This was not about verifying facts, it was about proving an assumption, and the space around them reflected that imbalance in subtle ways, the crowd leaning in just enough to witness, but not enough to intervene. The phones held steady at chest level, capturing everything while saying nothing, the city continuing its rhythm just a few feet away, as if this moment existed in a separate layer of reality. And Hayes gestured toward the car again, his hand firm, authoritative, drawing an invisible line that Aaliyah was not supposed to cross, not physically and not socially. And for a brief second his gaze flickered to the emblem on the hood, then back to her, that same unspoken calculation repeating, "This does not match, this does not belong." And that belief hardened his voice when he spoke again, reinforcing the distance between them, reinforcing the idea that ownership was something that needed to be justified when it came from someone like her. And still Aaliyah did not raise her voice, did not rush to prove herself in the way people expected, because somewhere beneath the pressure, beneath the eyes watching and the assumptions pressing in, she understood something. He did not. That truth did not become more real just because it was spoken louder, and so she stood there, grounded in it, while the imbalance between them became more visible with every passing second, not through confrontation, but through contrast, through the quiet difference between someone defending an assumption and someone holding on to what they knew was already theirs. Aaliyah let the silence stretch just long enough to make space for her voice to matter, not louder, not sharper, just clear, grounded, and steady as she lifted her gaze directly to Officer Hayes and said, "You can run the registration. My name is on it." And there was no hesitation in the way she spoke, no tremor, no apology woven into the words, only a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission to exist. And for a brief second the moment shifted, not visibly to everyone around them, but enough that the younger officer behind Hayes glanced down at his tablet again, his fingers hovering over the screen like he was waiting for a signal he was not sure he should need. While Hayes did not immediately respond, his jaw tightening just slightly, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, the smallest sign that something in her tone had not aligned with what he expected, because people who were uncertain usually spoke differently. They filled the air with explanations, with nervous details, with something to soften the situation, but Aaliyah had not done that. She had simply stated the truth and let it stand on its own, and that difference created a subtle tension that no one spoke about, but everyone could feel, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise predictable rhythm. And the crowd reacted in small ways, a few murmurs rising and falling, someone lowering their phone just a fraction as if reconsidering what they thought they were watching, and Hayes finally spoke again, slower this time, his voice still controlled, but carrying a trace of something less certain, something closer to resistance than authority, as he repeated procedure, asking for identification, for clarification, for confirmation in a way that sounded less like verification and more like insistence, as if repeating the process could restore the certainty he had started with. And Aaliyah reached into her pocket carefully, deliberately, every movement measured so there would be no misunderstanding, no sudden motion that could be misread, her fingers brushing against the smooth edge of her wallet before she pulled it out and held it up without stepping forward, maintaining the space he had created while refusing to shrink within it. And the sunlight caught the edge of the card as she slid it free, her name printed clearly, unmistakably. A simple piece of plastic carrying more weight than it should have in that moment, and she extended it just enough for him to see, not offering it like a request, but presenting it like evidence that had always been there. And the younger officer finally stepped closer, drawn by something he could not ignore anymore, glancing between the card and the tablet in his hand, his brow furrowing slightly as he began to input information, while Hayes watched, his expression tightening again, not with anger, but with the discomfort of a narrative beginning to shift without his control, and the car remained beside them, silent, reflective, unchanged, its presence no longer just a symbol of assumption, but slowly becoming something else, something that did not fit the story that had been placed on it just minutes before. And Aaliyah lowered her hand once the card had been seen, returning it to her wallet with the same calm precision, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if the entire moment rested not on proving herself, but on allowing the truth enough time to surface on its own. And in that space, that quiet, controlled space she held, the balance between them began to tilt, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. The air tightened in a way that no one announced, but everyone felt as the younger officer's fingers finally began to move across the tablet, each tap soft but deliberate, the faint clicking sound almost too quiet against the backdrop of the street, and yet it carried weight, because now the moment was no longer built only on assumption. It was beginning to lean toward verification, and Officer Hayes noticed it immediately, his eyes flicking down to the device, and then back up to Aaliyah with a sharper focus, like he was trying to regain control of something that was slowly slipping out of his hands. And his voice came again, firmer now, layered with a tension that had not been there before, asking questions that circled the same point from different angles: where she got the car, how long she had it, who else had access, questions that sounded procedural but carried an edge, as if repetition might uncover a contradiction if he pressed hard enough. And Aaliyah answered without rushing, each response measured, simple, consistent, her tone unchanged, her posture steady, and that steadiness began to stand out more than anything else, because it did not match the version of her that had been assumed just minutes ago and around them. The crowd shifted again, more people stopping now, a few voices rising slightly as curiosity turned into quiet speculation, someone whispering that this did not look like a stolen vehicle situation anymore. Someone else lowering their phone as if unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake unfolding in real time. And the car itself remained still, its polished surface reflecting the scene back at them. But now the reflection felt different, no longer reinforcing the officer's narrative, but quietly contradicting it. And the younger officer's brow tightened as he read something on the screen, his shoulders pulling back just slightly, a subtle but unmistakable sign that what he was seeing did not align with what had been assumed. And he hesitated, just for a second, before glancing toward Hayes, as if weighing whether to speak, whether to interrupt the flow of authority that had been established. And Hayes noticed that hesitation too, his jaw setting, his stance hardening again, not because he was certain, but because uncertainty had begun to enter the space and he did not welcome it. And he spoke again, directing the moment forward with more insistence, more structure, as if tightening the process could prevent it from unraveling. But something had already shifted, something small but irreversible, and Aaliyah felt it without needing to look, the way the attention around her changed, the way the silence carried a different tone now, less judgment, more observation, and she remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, allowing the process to continue without surrendering her composure, because she understood that this was the point where pressure often forced people to react, to defend louder, to push back. But she chose not to. She let the truth move at its own pace, knowing that it did not need force to arrive. And the younger officer finally spoke, his voice lower, more cautious, directed toward Hayes, but audible enough to shift the entire moment. And even before the words fully formed, before the confirmation was clearly stated, the tension in the air changed again, sharper now, like the edge of something about to break, not through confrontation, but through realization. And for the first time since the moment began, the certainty that had filled the space started to fracture, quietly, visibly, and impossibly to ignore. For a moment, everything slowed down without anyone asking it to, as if the street itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next, and the younger officer's voice came out quieter than before, careful, almost reluctant. The registration, it matches, and the words did not echo, they did not need to, they settled into the space with a weight that shifted everything at once. And Aaliyah did not react immediately, not outwardly. Her shoulders remained level, her hands still at her sides. But something inside her loosened, just slightly, like a breath she had been holding without realizing it. And the sunlight felt warmer again against her skin, no longer filtered through tension but clear, steady, real. And Officer Hayes did not move right away, his posture frozen in place for a fraction longer than it should have been, his gaze fixed somewhere between the tablet and the car, as if recalculating a version of reality that no longer aligned with what he had built in his mind. And the silence that followed was different from the one before, not heavy with assumption, but suspended with realization, and around them the crowd shifted again, a subtle ripple of understanding passing through people who had come expecting one kind of story and were now witnessing another unfold, some lowering their phones, others holding them steadier, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of awareness that something important had just changed. And Aaliyah's eyes drifted once more to the reflection on the car's surface, and this time when she saw herself there, it was not distorted by doubt or framed by someone else's expectation. It was simply her, standing exactly where she belonged. And she inhaled slowly, the air filling her lungs deeper now, steadier, the tension in her chest easing into something quieter, something closer to clarity. And no one spoke for a few seconds, not Hayes, not the younger officer, not the people watching, because the truth had already entered the space, and it did not need to be repeated, it did not need to be explained, it just existed, undeniable. And in that quiet, the contrast became unmistakable, between what had been assumed and what had always been real, between the authority that had acted with certainty and the reality that had never changed. And Aaliyah did not step forward to claim victory, did not raise her voice to assert anything more. She simply stood there, composed, present, allowing the moment to settle on its own terms, Because sometimes the most powerful shift did not come from confrontation, but from stillness, from letting the truth sit long enough for everyone to see it clearly. And as the sound of the city slowly returned, cars passing, distant voices blending back into the background, the moment did not end with a dramatic release. It ended quietly, with a realization that lingered in the air, subtle but irreversible, like a line that had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. And for the first time since it all began, the balance in that space no longer leaned against her. It stood level, undeniable, and still. Officer Hayes finally exhaled, but it was not relief that left his chest. It was something heavier, something slower, like the realization had weight to it. And for the first time since the moment began, his posture shifted not from authority, but from awareness, his shoulders easing just slightly as his gaze dropped from Aaliyah to the pavement and then back up again. And when he spoke, his voice had changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone across the street to notice, but enough that the space between them felt different, less rigid, less certain. "All right," he said, quieter now, the edge gone, replaced by something closer to restraint, and he stepped back half a pace, a small movement that carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it gave her space without saying why. And the younger officer lowered the tablet. His expression no longer conflicted but settled, the tension in his hands releasing as he glanced briefly at Aaliyah, then away, as if unsure where to place his attention now that the narrative had changed, and around them the crowd reacted in ways that were almost imperceptible. A few people turning their heads to each other, whispers passing between them, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to shift the atmosphere from assumption to recognition. And the phones that were still raised now captured something different, not a confrontation, but the aftermath of one, the quiet unraveling of a moment that should not have happened the way it did. And Aaliyah remained still, her expression composed, her breathing steady, but inside her the clarity had sharpened, not just about what had happened, but about what it meant, because this was never only about a mistake. It was about how easily that mistake had formed, how quickly certainty had replaced verification. And she saw it now in Hayes's eyes, not as an admission, not as an apology, but as a flicker of something unspoken, something that did not need to be named to be understood, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before speaking again, this time directing the moment forward. Procedural again, but stripped of the earlier assumption, confirming details that no longer carried accusation, only completion, and as he did, the imbalance that had defined the encounter began to dissolve, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that it could no longer hold its original shape, and Aaliyah's gaze drifted once more to the car, the same car that had been questioned just minutes before, now standing exactly as it had always been, unchanged, unbothered by the story placed on it. And she stepped closer to it now, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a calm that felt earned. Her hand reaching out to rest lightly against the door, the cool surface grounding, familiar, real, and the simple act of touching it again carried a quiet finality, a return to truth without the need for declaration. And behind her Hayes adjusted his stance, no longer blocking, no longer directing, just present in a moment that had shifted beyond his control, and the street resumed its rhythm. Fully now, cars passing, conversations picking back up, the world moving forward as if it always would. But the moment lingered, not in noise, not in confrontation, but in the space it left behind, a space where something had been revealed without being announced, where the difference between assumption and reality had been made visible, and where Aaliyah stood, not louder, not changed, but seen in a way that could not be undone. By the time Aaliyah's hand settled against the car door, the moment had already begun to move beyond the street, beyond the small circle of people who had witnessed it in real time, because the phones that had been quietly recording were no longer just observing. They were transmitting, and somewhere in the background, unseen but inevitable, the story had started to travel, clip by clip, frame by frame, carrying with it the contrast that no one could edit out, the calm in her voice against the certainty in his, the stillness in her posture against the assumption that had surrounded her. And she did not look at the cameras, did not acknowledge them, because her focus remained on what was in front of her, the present moment, the solid reality of the car beneath her fingertips, the steady rhythm of her breathing, but others were already reacting. The younger officer glancing briefly toward one of the phones as if realizing too late that this was no longer contained, while Hayes remained where he was, his expression composed but different now, less certain, more guarded, like someone aware that the moment had extended beyond his control, and a voice from the edge of the crowd spoke louder than before, not confrontational, just clear. She said it was hers. And that simple sentence carried further than anything that had been said earlier, because now it aligned with what had been confirmed. And the weight of it shifted the atmosphere again, not back to tension, but forward into something else, something closer to accountability. And Aaliyah opened the car door slowly, the soft click of the handle sounding louder than expected in the quiet that followed, and she paused for a second before stepping in, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because she understood that this moment, small as it might seem in the scope of everything else, mattered, not just to her, but to what it represented. And she turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to glance back toward the officers, her expression unchanged, not demanding, not forgiving, just present. And that look held something steady, something that did not accuse but did not ignore either. And Hayes met it briefly before looking away, a subtle acknowledgement that did not take shape as words, and the younger officer shifted his weight again, his posture no longer defensive, just uncertain, as if recalibrating his place in what had just happened, and the sound of a notification echoed faintly from somewhere in the crowd. Then another, and another, the ripple beginning, small but growing, as the captured moment started to reach beyond the street, into spaces where it would be seen, replayed, questioned, understood, and Aaliyah sat behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly on it, familiar, steady, and for a second she closed her eyes, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in a quiet reset, a return to herself after being pulled into something she had not chosen. And when she opened them again, the world in front of her looked the same street, the same light, the same movement of people and cars, but something had shifted beneath it, something that could not be undone, and without a word, without a final glance, she started the engine, the low hum grounding the moment back into motion, as the scene behind her remained, not erased, but left to settle on its own, in the silence that follows when truth has already been seen. The car moved forward slowly, merging back into the flow of the street as if it had always belonged there, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and yet the air behind it held something that lingered, something unspoken but present, like a mark that could not be seen but could not be erased either. And inside the car Aaliyah kept both hands on the wheel, her grip light, controlled, her eyes steady on the road ahead, the city unfolding in familiar lines of traffic lights, storefronts, and passing pedestrians, everything ordinary again on the surface. But beneath that surface something had settled deeper, something that would not fade as quickly as the moment itself. And her phone vibrated once in the cup holder, then again, a soft but persistent signal that the world outside this car was already reacting, already turning what had happened into something larger, something shared, something discussed. But she did not reach for it. Not yet, because right now she was still inside the moment, still processing the quiet shift from being questioned to being confirmed, from being doubted to simply existing in truth without needing to prove it again. And the sunlight stretched across the dashboard, warm and steady, casting soft reflections across the interior, grounding everything in something real, something unchanged. And in her rearview mirror the figures of the officers grew smaller, their presence fading into the background of the street until they were no longer distinguishable from anyone else standing there, just part of a moment that had already moved past them. And somewhere behind her the ripple continued, the video spreading, the conversation growing, the questions forming, not just about what had happened, but about how easily it had begun. And in that widening circle of awareness, accountability took shape in ways that did not require her to speak, did not require her to return, because the truth was already out there, visible, undeniable, carried by the very stillness she had held onto from the beginning. And she drove on, the road opening in front of her in long, clear lines, the engine humming softly beneath her hands. And for the first time since it started, the moment felt complete, not because it had been resolved perfectly, not because Anything had been corrected with words, but because it had been seen, fully and clearly. And sometimes that was where real change began, not in noise, not in confrontation, but in the quiet recognition of something that could no longer be ignored. And as the car disappeared into the rhythm of the city, the only thing left behind was the silence that followed, not empty, not forgotten, but filled with the weight of a truth that had finally been allowed to stand on its own.